Want to speak real English from your first lesson? Sign up for your free lifetime account at EnglishClass101.com.
Hi everybody, my name is Alicia. In this lesson, I'm going to talk about relative clauses. I'm also going to talk about reduced relative clauses. I'm going to start by introducing the main points of this grammar, and then I'm going to introduce a lot of example sentences so we can see the different ways that we use this grammar point. Let's begin. Okay, first, I want to begin by explaining what a relative clause is. So a relative clause is something like it's like a phrase, an extra phrase, like a long adjective. So we use relative clauses to give extra information about a noun. These come after the noun that they modify. So you can imagine in most cases in English, adjectives come before the nouns they modify, but a relative clause, it's kind of like an adjective. It tells us something extra about a noun, but this comes after the noun. Okay, so when we're making relative clauses, we use something called a relative pronoun. And basic relative clauses begin with a relative pronoun. So examples of relative pronouns are in this list here. So relative pronouns are that, which, who, whom, where, and when. So there are different situations where we use these relative pronouns. So when we use that and which, we're talking about we're talking about a person or an object, so that's people or things. The difference between that and which is actually related to a more advanced grammar point, which I have marked here. We use that in something that's called a restrictive clause. You might hear this word restrictive used, or there's another word that's used that's called descriptive clauses. So a restrictive clause is a clause that gives us essential information about the noun. I'll share some examples of this a little later. We use which, then, for people and things, as I said. It tends to sound a little more formal than that, and we use which in non-restrictive clauses, or you might hear the expression non-descriptive clauses as well. So a non-restrictive clause is a clause that gives non-essential information about a noun. So that means we don't have to have that information to understand the noun or to understand the situation completely. So again, I'll share some examples of these a little bit later. Let's look at the next pair. The next pair is who and whom. Who and whom. We use who for people, and some people like to use it for pets. It's kind of like the pet is a member of their family, so you might hear that. You might hear who used to talk about pets. Whom, then, is used for people as well if it's the object of the clause. This is a point that is becoming rarer. Fewer and fewer people are using whom in this way. In most cases, even native speakers tend to use who for all people. So this is one point to keep in mind. If you want to be absolutely perfectly correct, you can use whom, but to some people it might sound a little bit like too polite, or it might sound like you're trying too hard. So it's okay to use who if you're ever not sure. Finally, the last two are where and when. So we use where for places and when for time. So again, I'll share some examples of this in a moment. For now, let's take a look at the examples. I'll come back to these points a bit later. Let's look then at this first example sentence. So I've marked the relative clause in each sentence in red marker. So this first example sentence introduces a basic relative clause pattern. This marker, which my company bought, is red. So in this simple sentence, I'm describing this marker. This marker, which my company bought, is red. So here, my relative clause is this part right here. And there are a few different ways, a few hints you can remember to help you identify relative clauses. I've listed them here. The first hint, or the first tip to identify a relative clause is punctuation. Remember, punctuation means like a period, comma, question mark, and so on. A punctuation hint, relative clauses sometimes, not always, have these commas around the clause. This is also a really good hint that the relative clause is a non-restrictive clause. That means it's not essential to understand the noun. So this is one tip, but this is not always something that you can use. Sometimes there is not punctuation you can use. Tip number 2 is a phrase that begins with a relative pronoun. So in this case, the phrase does begin with a relative pronoun. Here it's which. So I talked about the relative pronoun which as one of the relative pronouns we use to describe people and things. So here we have a relative pronoun. It begins this phrase. Third, a phrase that follows a noun and gives us extra information about it. In this case, this expression, this phrase, comes after, it follows a noun, marker, and it tells us extra information. So we know that this is probably a relative clause. Another really great way to test is to try removing the clause and seeing if the sentence is grammatically correct. So if I remove this part, the sentence becomes, this marker is red. It's a grammatically correct sentence. So this marker is red. This is true. So that's basic information about this noun. If I want to give extra information, this marker, which my company bought, is red, I can do that with a relative clause. So this is a really simple example of a non-restrictive, actually, relative clause in a sentence. So this is non-essential information. We do not need this point to understand this noun, but it tells us something extra. Okay, so let's continue on to this next pair here. First, let's read the sentence. I want to read the first one. The computer that he bought online is really fast. The computer that he bought online is really fast. So here, of course, for today's lesson, the relative clause is in red. But as I mentioned, not all relative clauses are surrounded by punctuation marks. This is one example. So we tend to see this punctuation point with non-restrictive clauses. We can, however, see point 2 in this one, a phrase that begins with a relative pronoun. So here we see that is used. So this is one hint we can think about. And third, a phrase that follows a noun and gives us extra information about it. So we see computer is our noun here, and we see some extra information about the computer here. So we can be sure that this is a relative clause. Again, if we try to remove this, the computer is really fast, we make a grammatically correct sentence. So we can be confident that this is the relative clause. So why aren't there punctuation marks here? This is an example of what I mentioned before, a restrictive clause. So a restrictive clause is something that gives us essential information about the noun. So here we need this information in order to understand this noun. So the computer is really fast. But for some reason, the speaker wants to be specific. The computer that he bought online is really fast. So you might think, why do we need to know this information? Why is this essential information for this noun? This comes into play. That means this is something that's useful when you have a few items that you're comparing. You're talking about differences. So imagine you're speaking with a coworker and you're comparing different computers in your office. And you want to say something like, the computer that he bought online is really fast. And then you might say something like this, but the computer that he bought at a secondhand shop is slow. So the computer that he bought at a secondhand shop is slow. This follows the same pattern here, but we're comparing two different items, and we want to make it specific. We want to be clear which item is which. So this one that he bought online, so that's an essential piece of information about that computer. And the other one that he bought at a secondhand shop is slow. So we need this information right here. It's essential we have this information to understand the differences between these two nouns. So this is an example of a restrictive clause. Therefore, we use that here. That and no punctuation. So if you have a restrictive clause, you won't see these commas around the clause. So this is a quick introduction to that. I want to continue, though, to the next parts. In the following example sentences, I'm going to talk a little bit about reduced relative clauses. So a reduced relative clause is a relative clause that becomes shorter. It becomes smaller. Reduce, we reduce it. So To do that, I want to first talk about this point down here. And by reduce, I mean we can remove the pronoun, which I talked about over here. I'm off the screen, sorry. So to reduce a relative clause means we remove the pronoun and the linking verb. So the linking verb is usually the verb be, some form of be, like is or are. So when we reduce these, as we'll see in just a moment, the phrase becomes slightly shorter, that's all. It becomes easier to say, shorter to say. So we can reduce if, number one, the relative clause uses a relative pronoun and it uses the progressive form of the verb. Here, it uses an adjective, it uses the passive form, or it uses a prepositional phrase. So I'll share some examples of these. Second, we can reduce if the relative pronoun functions as the object of the clause. The object of the clause. So, a quick hint. If your relative pronoun is followed by a verb, it's the subject of the clause. So this is a really quick way to test. Is it the subject or the object? So if it's followed by a verb, we'll see it's the subject. Again, we'll see some examples. So with this in mind, let's take a look at all of these example sentences. First, I want to say all of these sentences are correct. There's no difference in meaning between a regular relative clause and a reduced relative clause. They mean exactly the same thing. We're just making the sentence a little bit shorter. So it's up to you to choose which you prefer. Let's look at an example. First, the guy who is talking to the teacher is my roommate. So here's my relative clause, who is talking to the teacher. The guy who is talking to the teacher is my roommate. So here we have the relative pronoun who, which we use for people. Who is, we see there's this linking verb, the be verb, and I have the verb in progressive tense, talking here. So this is one case where I can make a reduced relative clause because the relative clause uses a relative pronoun plus the progressive form of a verb, which we see here. So to reduce, we simply remove who is. Reduce with relative pronoun and with your linking verb in this case. So the sentence becomes, the guy talking to the teacher is my roommate. It's still grammatically correct, we've just removed part of the sentence. Let's look at another example. This is the book that you recommended. This is the book that you recommended. So here, my relative pronoun is that, and I've followed it with you recommended. So this is an example where there's no linking verb here, actually. So this is the book that is something that actually native speakers will drop here. This is the book you recommended. We can also make this sentence. So in some cases, I've seen some questions, some viewer questions, where uses of that, like this, people ask, should I use it? Shouldn't I use it? The kind of generally accepted guideline is that if you can remove that, it's good to do. It's not incorrect to include that in a situation like this, but just for clarity, it's often a good idea to remove it when possible. So this is the book that you recommended is perfectly fine. This is the book you recommended is also perfectly fine. So it's up to you to choose. Okay. And for a grammar point here, we see that the relative pronoun is not followed by a verb here. So this is one sort of example where you might choose to drop or not drop, actually. I personally would choose to drop here. Okay, let's move along then to the next one. Which of these drinks that are on the table is yours? So here my relative clause is that are on the table, that are on the table. Here I have my relative pronoun, I have my linking verb, are in this case, then I have a prepositional phrase that are on the table. So I mentioned prepositional phrases can be reduced. We can make a reduced relative clause if we're using a prepositional phrase. That means, which of these drinks on the table is yours? So again, we can remove the relative pronoun and the linking verb there. Okay, another example. Did everyone who took the class trip get sick? Did everyone who took the class trip get sick? So here there's a big hint. We see our relative pronoun, yes, but the relative pronoun is followed by a verb. Here it's took, past tense of take. So that means we actually cannot reduce this one. We cannot make a change to this one. Did everyone took the class trip get sick? That's not correct. We cannot do that. So this sentence, there is no change here. Let's look at the next one. This is the place where we first met. This is the place where we first met. So here, my relative pronoun is where. I mentioned where is used for places. Here, there's no verb that follows it. So this is one case, again, like we saw up here. There's no linking verb here either, but because it's functioning as the object, we can remove it. This is the place we first met. This is the place we first met. So it's okay to remove that there. Okay, one more example. Do you remember the time when we went on a family trip to Europe? So here, I'm using when because it's a time question. And again, we don't have a verb here. There's nothing here. Again, we have this we. So we can remove this part if we like. Do you remember the time we went on a family trip to Europe? Is also okay. So there are these examples like this one, and this one, where there's no linking verb, but because the relative pronoun functions as the object of the clause, it's okay to remove it. So in these cases, it's quite natural to include it, but in cases like that, because that is such a common word, it's kind of a guideline, I suppose, to try to remove it where possible. Okay, so that was a lot of information, I know, but this is a pretty good, I hope, introduction to relative clauses, how to make them, and some different patterns that you can use, especially when you're reducing them. So I hope that this was helpful for you. If you have any questions or comments, or if you want to practice making an example sentence with a relative clause, please feel free to do so in the comment section of this video. Of course, if you liked the video, please don't forget to give it a thumbs up, subscribe to our channel if you have not already, and check us out at EnglishClass101.com for some other things that can help you with your English studies. Thanks very much for watching this lesson, and I will see you again soon. Bye-bye.
Want to speed up your language learning? Take your very first lesson with us. You'll start speaking in minutes and master real conversations. Sign up for your free lifetime account. Just click the link in the description.